Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor of international management at Middlesex University, where my main role is being a research mentor and leading our staff development program. This presentation will be a little different from most other presentations. I will not talk about a specific paper or even a specific stream of research, but rather about what I think needs to change for our academic work to provide real value to the field, to other academics, but also to society at large. I will focus on international mobility research, but many of the issues that I will discuss today are relevant to international HRM research in general, or even to management or international business research in general. However, towards the end of the presentation, I will also spend a bit of time talking about positioning yourself in academia as a PhD student, and I hope that will be useful to you too. Okay, before I start, you will notice that many of the slides have URLs on them with links to blog posts with further information. You can access these through the handouts or simply by Googling them and you'll find them easily. So this is where the literature was when I started my PhD in the early 90s, looking back to what was published from the 70s onwards. The focus was very much on expatriates only, and they were typically company-initiated expatriates. They were also typically white male expatriates who had a dependent wife and were sent out from what we call weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries, moving to developing countries in need of skilled labor. The topics that were studied were largely expatriate adjustment and performance, selection, training and compensation, so the traditional HR functions, but then applied to expatriates, and a little bit about the role of expatriation, such as position filling, management development, organizational coordination and control, but much of that was really descriptive. The research methods used in this period were largely surveys or big databases with secondary data, and the research methods used in terms of analysis were typically either descriptive or regression analysis. So in the next 20 years, the field developed quite significantly, first of all in terms of population. The type of expatriates studied changed in terms of direction, not just moving from headquarters to subsidiaries, but also impatriates moving from subsidiaries to headquarters. In terms of demographics, looking at age, gender and sexual orientation. In terms of profession, looking at, for instance, at academics, sports expatriates, military. In terms of the length of assignment, looking at frequent travelers. Basically, name an internationally mobile group of employees and it has been studied. In addition to that, academics also started to become interested in migrants, mostly highly skilled migrants, but they were still mostly focused on Western home countries. The topics studied also remained fairly similar in terms of focusing on adjustment, selection and training, but then for all of these new groups. There was a bit of a connection though with knowledge transfer because expatriates started to be seen as key vehicles for knowledge transfer. So this led to a connection with the headquarters subsidiary literature and the knowledge-based view. So in these 20 years, the research methods included an increasing number of interview-based studies and fairly small-scale surveys of these specific populations that we've just talked about. There's also quite a lot of studies on the choice between parent country nationals and host country nationals in top management teams of subsidiaries using one and the same database of Japanese multinational corporations. The field really started to develop as a separate field, especially after getting a specific track at the European Academy of Management. And in my view, started to increasingly isolate itself from mainstream international business with a lot of specialization. This is, of course, completely natural for a field that's finding its own place and identity, but in my view, it didn't really lead to a coherent body of knowledge.
So, if this is where the field is at the moment, what do we need to change? Well, first of all, I think we need to look at the population. We saw that the field has developed mostly by studying different types of expatriates rather than studying different topics or research methods or using different theories. However, the focus has still been very much on a narrow group of elite mobile people. By no means the first who has signaled this issue. You'll find it summarized very well in this introduction of a recent book by Yvonne McNulty and Chris Brewster. So what does need changing in terms of population? Well, first of all, I would say refocus and reintegrate. Self-initiated expatriation? What's the difference between that and highly skilled migrants? And why are we only studying highly skilled migrants in the first place? And why are we focusing on such a limited number of home countries? And then in terms of repatriation, can we get a little bit more sophisticated in this? For instance, the article that I've recently published with Florence Duvivier looks at how different types of international assignments can be used differently in knowledge transfer between headquarters and subsidiaries, looking at long-term expatriation, short-term expatriation, and repatriation, and how they transfer different types of knowledge between headquarters and subsidiaries. So repatriation is not just a poor cousin of expatriation, it's a staffing strategy in its own right. So in addition to having a broader perspective on the population that we're studying, I also think we need to seek better integration with theories from neighboring disciplines. For instance, we already draw quite a bit on strategy when we look at the role of international mobility in knowledge transfer. The article by Florence Duvivier I mentioned earlier actually built on an earlier article that I did with Marcus Pudelko and Sebastian Reich on the role of expatriates and repatriates in knowledge transfer. And this perspective is increasingly popular in the strategy literature, where they talk about the micro foundations of strategy, so how individuals in an organization contribute. Then another area of research that we can and should draw on is diaspora and migration research, where researchers have done a lot of work on social networks of the diaspora and migrants, international trade resulting from these networks, and international entrepreneurship, because migrants are typically more likely to get engaged in international entrepreneurship. One key example is an article by Maria Elo, who's looking at female migrants who suffer from what she calls brain waste in multiple ways due to institutional aspects, due to discrimination, and partly also to inherent social cultural norms in particular countries. So she provides recommendations on how private and public sectors can improve female talent perception and integrate female talent better in their organizations. And then there is another area of research which over the last 25 years have moved from being on the periphery of international business to almost being in the mainstream of international business, the language in international business. A recent article by Ivan Volkanov in Journal of Global Mobility talks about how language-related topics are really not yet common practice in international mobility research, and most studies actually completely ignore language apart from language training for expatriates. But language is important in selection, in adjustment, in knowledge transfer, but also in building up trust between expatriates and local employees. So one area we should certainly draw more on in terms of international mobility research is international organization behavior. And here we're dealing with topics such as identity and identity change, ethnic versus cultural similarity, issues of leadership, issues of teamwork, and maybe even virtual teams. I'm picking out 2 articles here, both written by my former PhD student. The first one of ostriches, frogs, birds and lizards looks at expatriations and their cultural identity negotiation strategies, where we argue that expatriates actually might choose different identity negotiation strategies in different contexts. And we use an animal analogy for this. And if you want to figure out which animal does what, you'll have to read the article. And then the second article by Fan is looking at expatriates who are ethnically similar but culturally different from the country they are sent to. So, for instance, Chinese Americans or Australian Americans. And they expect to have an easier time than, say, white Western expatriates in these countries, because they might have a natural affinity with the culture. But in reality, they find that they're facing all sorts of challenges. And we've written up a practitioner article that carefully documents the key challenges that they're facing. And then another area that we could draw more on is the area of gender and diversity. And obviously there have been studies on female expatriates, but simply as a comparison group. So how do female expatriates differ from male expatriates, for instance? But in a recent conference paper, we argue that the lack of mobility for female managers and their lack of opportunity to go on international assignments might actually have serious career prospects and damaging career effects for female managers. And then obviously a final area that international mobility research could draw on is human resource management. This in fact has already been done to quite a significant extent, especially in the area of talent management, where Sedin and Brewster 7 years ago already published a paper on integrating talent management and expatriation and defining global talent management, which would be a combination of high potential development and global careers. So far we've looked mostly at drawing theoretical foundations from other disciplines within business and management, but obviously we can look much further than this and look at the other social sciences. For instance, I came across this very intriguing article in geography. Privileged mobilities, locating the expatriate in migration scholarships. The article talks about migrants who are privileged by citizenship, class or race are largely still absent from mainstream migration research and theory. So the exact opposite of what we've seen in international mobility research. They are clearly trying to learn from us. So we should certainly try and learn from what is published in geography as well. And then earlier we talked about the length of expatriation. So if we're talking about temporary expatriation, why not draw from tourism as well? A former colleague of mine, Ting Ting Li, has looked at how diaspora tourists construct social capital. This is something that could be very useful for international mobility research as well. And then obviously there is sociology, a discipline which puts the phenomena in a wider societal perspective. And a great example is this book which looks at expatriate identities in post-colonial organizations and looks at how post-colonial relationships impact on expatriation and how it is perceived. And then the discipline of economics that has looked, for instance, at labor market issues related to expatriation. For instance, this article looking at regulations in the form of quota on a number of expatriates and how this impacts on the employment conditions of locals. So geography, tourism, sociology, economics. We can also think about political science, history, anthropology, communication studies. I think we should cast the net much more widely than we've done to date. And then research methods. As I mentioned earlier, to date the international mobility literature has largely relied on surveys, interviews and secondary data. But I think we can be much more creative than that. For instance, look at experiments, which my former PhD student Xie Fan has used quite a bit. In her PhD, for instance, she used vignettes in a field experiment with employees of multinational corporations in China, in which she included scenarios in which ethnic similarity was either emphasized or de-emphasized, and tested how that impacted on host country employees' attitudes towards expatriates. She's also written up a book chapter on using experiments in international business in the book Managing Multilingual Workplaces. And then dyadic surveys. So these are still surveys, but they are targeted at both parties of a relationship. So if we're talking about international mobility research, that's often the expatriates and the host country employee. So again, in her PhD, Xie Fan asked both the expatriates and their local counterpart to answer a survey, and these surveys were then matched to compare their responses. So these were all very quantitative methods, but obviously we can look at qualitative methods as well and go beyond interview studies. One very exciting article I saw recently used a diary study, studying the distinct role of 4 different social groups in the expatriate social network. So the host country nationals, the home country nationals, the key foreign expatriates and compatriots on expatriate adjustment. And they reasoned that they really wanted to do exploratory research, so a diary study to document these relationships was ideal for them. And then ethnography, which is a research method that has been used increasingly in international business research by academics such as Marioko Brannan and Fiona Moore, but which hasn't to date really found any significant usage in international mobility research. And then I think we need to be honest that a lot of the research in our field has been very academically focused, focusing mainly about making a small contribution to the literature, rather than looking at a broader canvas and see how we can actually help addressing some of today's key challenges. And obviously, if we're talking about international mobility in particular, this has been hugely impacted by global challenges such as climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. So very obvious questions would be, can we replace the knowledge transfer, control, coordination and management development roles of expatriation with other means? Can we maybe use more third country nationals rather than parent country nationals if mobility in some countries remains restricted? I'm certainly not the first one, of course, to argue for this. And in fact, a lot of colleagues in recent years have done exactly this. You will probably have seen a recent special issue in the global Journal of Global Mobility on expatriation in a VUCA world, an environment characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity. There's also been an increasing number of people working on migrants and refugees. with a really excellent article by Lee and a couple of co-authors who review and synthesize the literature on refugee employment and workforce integration, and introduce a concept which they call the canvas ceiling, which is a systematic barrier to refugee workforce integration, and obviously a play on the words glass ceiling that are used for another minority group, women. Bettina Schluderek has also done some great work in this area, and I really encourage you to visit the URL, which has some really exciting videos about the work she has done. It's also an excellent example of how to disseminate your research to a broader audience in an attractive format. And then there have been some key review articles in journals such as Journal of International Business Study and the Journal of International Business Studies and Journal of World Business, looking at key societal challenges and also reviewing the literature in the last 30 years and then looking forward. If you are interested in really making a difference, I would strongly encourage you to study these two articles carefully. And then last but not least, some journals have started to experiment with new submission formats. For instance, the Journal of World Business has started a new rapid review process, which is really meant for topics with big societal and practical relevance, where academics can submit papers that will be really rapidly reviewed. Okay, so we've talked about the need to broaden our study populations to ensure a better theoretical integration with business and management research, for the need for interdisciplinary research, the need to expand our repertoire of methods, and the need to embark on research that addresses key societal challenges. There are two more things, however, that I would really like to impress on you, and they are: don't be afraid to be different, and don't be afraid to be critical. So first of all, and somewhat paradoxically, we all study what we are familiar with. So don't feel you need to apologize for this. Don't feel that you need to apologize for studying female expatriates as a female academic. Don't feel you have to apologize for studying expatriates in your home country. Remember, the seminal researchers in this field did research too. They were white, male, generally Anglo academics studying white, male, generally Anglo expatriates. That's perfectly fine. Different populations, different researchers should study different populations. And in fact, if I look at the recent book I published with two of my former PhD students, Lin Zhong and Xie Fan, Managing Expatriates in China, their familiarity with the country context was a key drawcard of the book. Second, try to leverage author collaborations across ethnic boundaries. Many publications, in fact, have authors of similar ethnicity, whether that's white Western, Asian or African. And if there are collaborations, they tend to be non-Western juniors writing with their white Western PhD supervisors. And the juniors are socialized into Western perspectives. In our recent paper in Organization Studies with Hunjun Lee and Katsu Yoshikama, we were trying to provide a fresh perspective on country of origin effects on multinational staffing policies. And the paper took probably about 8 years all in all to get published, from first ideas to publication. However, I think our conversations about the topic from different national and ethnic perspectives, Korean, Japanese and Dutch, led to a much better paper, and I really enjoyed our collaboration, so I'm kind of sorry the paper is published now. And then third, be brave enough to write less formulaic papers. A recent paper I published with Marcus Pudelko in Management International Review is in fact a combination between a perspective paper, a literature review and an empirical paper, all used to argue that cultural distance as a concept is overused and that entry mode choice can actually be explained much better by home and host country cultural and institutional factors than by cultural distance. I won't deny it was hard to get the paper published, but I'm really happy that we stuck to our current format because I think it's all the more impactful for it. And then finally, don't feel you have to publish every single paper in an A journal. There are different outlets for different types of work. You might enjoy listening to my YouTube video on this, which outlines at least 7 different types of outlets. And also don't forget that whether before or after publication, engagement with social media can be a really good way to bring your research to a broader audience. Okay, then last but not least, be critical. Don't think that established theories are set in stone. They're not holy. They might in fact be based on very, very simple research methods, very limited samples. If I look at my own paper in Journal of World Business in 2001, it had extremely simplistic statistical analysis. And the typology that I came up with, bears, bumblebees and spiders, this was just something that came out of a conversation with my husband. And I was just so surprised to hear young PhD students at conferences talking about it 15 years later as if this was like an established thing and they couldn't touch it. Of course not. Research is progress. It's not about treating prior work as set in stone. And then don't feel you have to wait until you're a full professor to be allowed to be critical. Even as a PhD student, you are allowed to criticize other people's work as long as you do it with justification and with respect. My first ever article that I published in the International Journal of IHRM in 1995, The Persistent Myth of High Expatriate Failure Rates, was in fact a very critical article in a way because it showed that there was a myth that expatriate failure rates were incredibly high, and that was created by massive misreferencing of 3 articles, and only one of these articles contained solid empirical evidence, and it showed to be expatriate failure rates to be rather low. I did kind of pause for a while and think, should I publish this? But I talked about it with my PhD supervisor, Arndt Sorge, and he said, go ahead, science is about progress. And I can't say that anyone has reacted negatively to me about this. I might have had some strange glances at conferences, but overall, I think the article was very well received. And even though the article was well received, people did in fact continue to make the same claim. So after about 5 or 6 years, I thought maybe I should phrase this slightly differently. So I tried to bring this at a higher level and say, well, maybe it's about inadequate referencing. So I wrote an article about our referencing errors undermining our scholarship and credibility. So even if you don't get it right the first time, you can possibly reframe the same message at a higher level or in a slightly different perspective and publish it in another article, in another journal, making another contribution. And in fact, the article I published with Marcus Pudelko that I mentioned earlier was the second try to get the same message across. I tried this before in 2004, but that was just a literature review, whereas in the 2016 article we made a more extensive conceptual argument and also had empirical work. So you can revisit earlier work as well, making it more impactful as you go along. So that's the end of my presentation. And for those of you who are watching this as preparation for the Henley PhD Masterclass in International Business, I really look forward to our live session and your questions later this month. For those of you who are listening to this as part of the International HRM seminar series, I'm looking forward to your questions in the Q&A. And for those of you who are listening to this on my YouTube channel, feel free to post questions as comments below the video and I'll try to answer them.